Good afternoon, ex-Winterview, back again with a brief dialogue for his dear friend, Annastacey, once again driving along back home from the office. This brief dialogue is on the conditioning of the body, or the body-mind. It is a common source of frustration for the spiritual seeker to travel along the path to enlightenment, hoping that at some point along this path the ills and problems of their life will clear up or clean up or banish or something. And that's a fair enough goal, why not? But the other thing that comes along with that are the emotional states of the body which are taken often as signals for one's success, one's progress, or seemingly one's failure. I've heard many an spiritual aspirant, tell me that they feel stuck, they feel they have stalled, or they're going backwards, or they need to understand something that they're not quite understanding. And when we discuss this, it turns out very frequently, not all the time, but quite frequently, that they are taking a signal from the emotional system of the body as an indication of failure, which conversely, that's the word, they would take emotional signals for success. And emotional signals for success, no doubt, would be positive emotions, so-called welfare emotions: happiness, joy, peace, love, acceptance, enthusiasm, etc., etc. And so I thought I'd take a brief dialogue to go through some of the basics on the emotional state and ask the important question: should we take these signals to mean something spiritual, or something other than what they were intended? The body is very easily conditioned to stimulus, very, very easily, and we know from behavioral research, years of behavioral research, that there are so many conditioned stimulus that the body responds to that it would blow your mind if you had to list them all. And I was reminded, because I work in mental health, one of the primary parts of an assessment, you could say, or even treatment, is to figure out for the person with the mental health problem what might trigger a relapse or an adverse emotional state. That especially true, just for example, in drug and alcohol addiction. You ideally want your client in that setting to remove cues that might trigger cravings or memories or thoughts about having a drink or taking drugs. And in some ways, a lot of the management of drug and alcohol, it can be simply removing them from the environment or having them change behavioral patterns so they can break the association. For example, don't walk down the street where you used to drink in that bar. You'll get memories straight away, and you might trigger a craving. But we're triggered all the time. We don't understand all the various things to which we are triggered, and the triggering itself is simply a very sophisticated mechanism, you could say, to alert the body to possible threat or possible reward even in the environment. And this has adaptive value for the organism to be able to register these triggers and note something's wrong or something's very right here, this is actually very good. So we could have, just for example, going back in time, the smell of smoke is a a very universal trigger. It would be hard to imagine a human who is not in some ways alarmed on a very subtle or overt level at the smell of burning, especially in a context where they do not expect to smell that, such as it being at home, at work, in your car, etc. The smell of burning something triggers a very primal alert in the human. And recently at work, where I work, there was in fact a fire. The fire alarm went off. We were sitting there quite happily, typing away, I think, at the time on our computers, and then the fire alarm went off, and usually it's a false alarm because these things go off more often than not with a false alarm. But in this case, there was actually a fire, and it was a small fire. It was I think a patient had put a cigarette in a laundry bin or something like that, and so there was a very faint odor of burning in the air, just very faint. But with the alarm and the sudden recognition of this faint burning smell in the air, boy, did you see people leave that building very quickly. So there's a classic example of conditioning, or maybe not conditioning in that case. I just thought because it's burning, it might be something more primal to the organism. You can get conditioned to all sorts of things. You might have had a bad experience in for example, a Mexican restaurant or a Chinese restaurant, or some exotic food that you're not used to. Maybe you had food poisoning, and then from that point, the smell of that food could trigger discomfort in the future, maybe make you feel nauseous or sick just by smelling it, just by even seeing the restaurant. The point of all this is that there are a very wide array of triggers that we probably don't even know of, that we're reacting to and responding to throughout the day, little imperceptible or sometimes perceptible shifts in our emotional state. And so when it comes to spirituality, we could ask a very valid question. Should we take emotional states as any type of cue to spiritual progress or regress? Is it valid? I don't know the answer to that, to be honest. It's a very tricky I can't even speak. Very tricky subject to even think about. We know, for example, that in so-called spiritual progress, there can often be the relinquishing of a point of view or a belief that was held for a long time, that you can take or see a greater perspective, and that can feel like, in some ways, some kind of progress. I've shifted my beliefs about something that I used to believe is true. After I was, for example, meditating for a while, I suddenly realized something about the world. And when that belief moved or shifted or left or whatever you want to call it, I felt relaxed. I felt a relaxing in the physiology and a peacefulness. So there's your signal. That's the signal, the feeling of peacefulness. And then there's the brain interprets the signal. The signal, peace and whatever, is taken as progress. I've made some progress today. Conversely, we all know this one. We've perhaps been meditating for a long time, and we get ourselves into a nice chilled out sort of state where we feel this sort of benign equanimity towards all life and all living creatures, and then we get an unexpected letter or phone call with very bad news. It's perhaps the death of a friend, or the loss of a lot of money, or an eviction notice, something quite big, a very stressful thing, and suddenly all that peace that we'd worked so carefully to cultivate goes out the window, and we find ourselves in a sort of erratic roller coaster of life. Suddenly maybe we're in court for something we've done, or someone doesn't like us and there's a battle at work, and maybe I'm going to get fired for something my boss thinks I did, and and so on and so forth. And all the signals now are negative, they're unpleasant: worry, concern, depression, anxiety, and the brain has to interpret these somehow. And if you're on a so-called spiritual journey, well, they have to be framed contextually within that. I mustn't have made any progress. I must be back to square one, it might go. But the the mind is very sneaky too, because it can take these signals and it can spin them in any way it so desires. You know, you probably heard this one where there's a lot of negativity coming up for someone in someone's life, and you'll hear a comment from a sort of guru figure or a well-informed friend that you must be making great progress because a lot of stuff is coming up for you, a lot of negativity. You know, you hear that one quite a lot. Or you hear sometimes, I think this is more in the Buddhist tradition, when the aspirant is very happy that they're feeling peace and joy and love, and the master just says, well, that's nothing, you know. that's just stuff for tourists. And the young Buddhist aspirant feels very crestfallen. Oh, I thought I was making progress. I was feeling all this peace and love and da-da-da. And that can be dismissed as immaterial. It doesn't matter. So what do we do with this? What do we do with this information? As you sit here now listening to this dialogue, are you wondering, wow, how have I framed my spiritual journey in my mind, my quest for enlightenment? What signals am I recognizing and subsequently interpreting to mean something? Do they mean anything? Do the signals mean anything? Could it be that the signals are meaningless? Absolutely meaningless. Could it be that I sometimes feel angry in traffic when people do something stupid, and that's fine, and I will continue to feel that even if I have the so-called state of enlightenment? Will I still think people are stupid on the highway and continue to get annoyed with them? Or am I trying to reach a point of emotional maturity where I see all experience with a sort of benign, loving acceptance? So even the so-called stupid maneuver in the car ahead of me on the highway is just seen as just another part of the appearance and nothing to worry about. You know, that kind of benignness. Is that what I'm trying to do? Is that what I imagine the end result to be? Is that what I imagine the state of enlightenment is like? Do I imagine the guru figure, at least, who sits quietly at the front of a large auditorium and has a sort of enigmatic smile and talks very softly and very sweetly and gazes meaningfully around the room at people who seem to have made it to some point of emotional maturity that just seems so amazing? Is that somehow secretly what I hope I'll achieve as well? And so getting back to this conditioning, the body is a very sophisticated survival organism. Like, sophisticated in a way that would blow your mind if you really had to think of all the things it juggles from moment to moment in terms of its survival. And for someone who's had a difficult upbringing, and by difficult, let's just use the generic form of difficult. Perhaps there was violence of parents separating or divorcing, domestic violence, drugs and alcohol perhaps in the family system, hostility within the family system, some kind of family crisis, perhaps poverty, loss of money, loss of health, some sort of very difficult upbringing, or even a dangerous neighborhood could be a difficult upbringing in some ways. The organism, that is the body, would adapt to that in some ways. It's very, very clever, and perhaps in some, let's choose a tough inner city neighborhood, for example, it would not be wise necessarily to skip merrily about with gay abandon, not taking in all the potential threats. It's very unlikely that you'd get someone like that. It would be more adaptive in some ways to be cautious, to not trust people because they could rob you in that neighborhood. Maybe gang violence was a real part of your upbringing, where if you didn't join a gang, you were going to be toast every time you left your front door. And so you became either a gang member, or you became very wary or violent yourself or whatever. And that it's not because you set out at the start of your life to become violent. The environment in that situation shaped or conditioned you. But now, as a mature adult who's moved away from that neighborhood, perhaps, or thought you'd got away from the old life, perhaps the old patterns are still very well entrenched in the body. The body doesn't forgive very easily. Once it's learned a survival pattern, it's going to keep using that because it works. Or it has worked, I should say. And even if the context changes, often you'll find people not changing with their context shift. So people from violent neighborhoods who live in peaceful neighborhoods often bring that cautiousness, that wariness, that aggression to the new setting, even though they don't need it. But you can't just tell the body, hey, relax, you don't need to do that anymore. The body will still react and respond. And now I'm giving a very oversimplistic example. We could add on layers to that, add on domestic violence with the parents who scream and shout, perhaps beating you or being mean to you, bullying you, so you become adapted to that and develop defense mechanisms for that. Perhaps your parents were indifferent, didn't care about you, and you became defended against that. Perhaps you were bullied badly at school, teased, mocked, etc. Perhaps you had a health challenge that was serious. Maybe you had cancer or another form of chronic long-term illness that was debilitating in some ways, and you learned that this is who you are. This became your identity. You adapted to that. You became defended against that. It's a big ask to change the body suddenly and go, hey, you know what, all that conditioning that you learned when life was difficult, you can forget about all that now because everything's fine. That's a fantasy. That's a wonderful mind fantasy. So there you are now, perhaps as an adult. I don't know how old you are listening to this, but as an adult, you've got all that heritage, and you have genetic heritage too, let's not forget. And the more research that comes out about genetics shows that there's a lot more going on in your behavior from genetic influence than we had previously imagined. Generation upon generation of conditioning can be passed down through the genes. Why? Because there's adaptive value, you might say, survival value for that. So here you are now, spiritual aspirant, taking cues from your body's emotional state as to whether you're making progress, spiritual progress, or not. And yet your body could just be acting out with its animal survival conditioning. Should you be taking your body's cues, therefore, as anything other than what they were designed for? Signals for threat, signals for value. Worth thinking about. Not being the kind of guy to tell you what to do, just think about it. Alright, that's all for this brief dialogue. I hope in some ways it was of value. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks again for listening.